of the resources that we will be talking about today. You can find more information about them at the mcmullenarea.org/GIA webpage. But with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Marshall English. I know that we were hoping to share some pre-recorded content, but I think that Dr. English is going to have to share live due to some audio changes. So I'm going to send it over to Dr. English, and if there are any further audio issues, just send me a message in the chat and I will help.
Well, thank you, Ashley. So I had pre-recorded this because I wanted it to be smooth and cover all the points in some kind of coherent order. But I may be stumbling a bit because I'm going to be reading from my notes. So the presentation today is going to take a look at some of the research on deficit irrigation that's been done in California and elsewhere, and also offer some observations about deficit irrigation on working farms that I have been witness to. I served as extension specialist for irrigation management at Oregon State University, and most of my work was with farms in the Columbia Basin east of the Cascades. That region is pretty dry, and some of the farms there have much more land than water. My first encounter with deficit irrigation in practice was on a working farm in the Columbia Basin that has had about 3 generations of experience with deficit irrigation. And today they're farming about twice as much land as they could have with conventional full irrigation. And they've been very successful at it. And there are many other farms in the Columbia Basin with generations of practical experience with deficit irrigation. And I have to say, I learned a lot from them. But I also saw a couple of farms that pushed it too far. In any situation with deficit irrigation, it's useful where it might be useful. There will be some optimum level of deficit irrigation. And a couple of the farms I worked with went beyond that point. They tried to cover too much ground with the water they had, and it was pretty clear that they lost money. So, deficit irrigation, is it a good idea? That depends. It largely depends on not overdoing it and on getting the irrigation timing right. So there are 3 topics listed here that I would like to talk about in this presentation. First, I'd like to illustrate how the productivity of water increases with deficit irrigation. I'd also like to go through a few specific examples involving different crops and farms to develop some perspective on the potential economic merits of deficit irrigation. And I'd like to look at the issue of crop yield estimation, which is central to deficit irrigation management. Deficit irrigation, what is it about? Let's first define conventional irrigation. The central objective of conventional irrigation, as system designers and managers have been taught for generations, has been to maximize yields per unit of land. That requires avoiding crop stress that would reduce crop yields or quality. 60 years ago, the American Society of Agronomy published a monograph on technical materials to be used for education and training of irrigation professionals. And that monograph stated that irrigation should be managed to avoid crop stress that would reduce yield or quality. And since then, other technical manuals use the same basic premise that irrigation has to be managed to avoid stress. NRCS National Engineering Handbook for Irrigation Management stated that soil water should be maintained above the level at which crops are stressed, and that statement was still cited in the 2021 edition of that handbook, that manual. Deficit irrigation is fundamentally different. It's not designed to avoid stress, it's designed to manage stress. The goal is to maximize not yields per se, but to maximize net returns to water, to maximize net farm income to be gained with limited water. The logic behind deficit irrigation is that the last few inches of applied water are often not very productive, so it may be better to withhold some of that water and use it in some other way. It might be used to increase irrigated acreage if you have more land than water. Might be transferred to another crop that needs the water and is more profitable, or it might be sold on the spot market. So is it a good idea? Again, that depends. In some situations, it's definitely a good idea. Sometimes it may not be a good idea. And for some situations, it can be a good idea, but risky at the same time. So then it depends upon the manager's attitudes about risk. I want to begin by looking at data from an intensive study of deficit irrigation that illustrates how the productivity of water changes with deficit irrigation and how much it changes. This study involved irrigated wheat, and I know that's not an important crop locally for you people, but it is very different. First of all, it is very different from tree crops and other perennials. But bear with me, these data will illustrate some important points, and we'll get on to other crops pretty quickly. The study involved irrigating with varying amounts of water ranging from 30% of full irrigation to 110%. We also looked at irrigation timing in relation to critical stages of crop development and at various irrigation frequencies, including irrigation every other day, irrigation weekly, irrigation every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and 4 weeks. We also looked at limiting irrigation to just preseason application. This graph shows seasonal water use and yield for each of those various treatments. Let's first, next slide, Charles. We'll first focus on, on 5 of those plots that were irrigated once a week. These 5 data points are for 5 levels of water, 8 inches, 12, 17, 21, and 26 inches. The lowest level of water use was designed to replace 30% of crop water, of ET, I should say. The other plots were targeting 50, 70, 90, and 110% of full irrigation. These photos show the crop canopies for 2 of those weekly irrigation treatments, the 70% and 30% irrigation levels. If you look closely at these, you can see the most pronounced differences between those 2 treatments was the leaf mass. The heads of grain are thinner at the 30% level on the right, but the biggest differences we observed was in the leaf mass. The reason was that irrigation timing was aligned with critical stages of crop development. Deficits in applied water were significantly curtailed during the critical grain, deficits in applied water were timed to occur during leaf growth and other non-critical stages of growth. Water use was not significantly curtailed during the critical grain filling stage late in the season. So for that irrigation treatment on the right, where the applied water was only 30% of full irrigation, the grain yield was almost 50% of the full irrigation treatment. So let's look at the productivity of water in these treatments. Some of this slide is missing. Productivity is the harvestable yield divided by the depth of applied water. Looking at the calculated productivity at 3 of these levels of water use, you can see that productivity increased as water use decreased. At 25 inches at full irrigation, productivity was 375 pounds per acre inch. At 17 inches, it was up to 533 pounds per acre inch. And at about 8 inches, it was 568 pounds per acre inch. That's 60% increase in productivity compared to full irrigation. So it looks as though we could produce more wheat by reducing the depth of irrigation and then using the water saved to irrigate more land. I'll come back to that statement in a couple of minutes. First, I want to talk about how irrigation timing relates to productivity. So yields under deficit irrigation are not just a function of the amount of water applied, they can also be affected by irrigation timing. Deficit irrigation generally involves some degree of crop stress, and management of deficit irrigation requires not only that we control the level of water stress, we also have to control the timing of stress, particularly during critical stages of crop development. And good timing requires that we track crop water availability closely and anticipate crop stress. We've been focusing on the last slides, we're focusing on the weekly irrigation schedule from that deficit study. This graph shows water use and yields for a different schedule, this one involving 4-week intervals between irrigations. So the data points here represent different schedules that were staggered 10 days apart, each schedule having a 4-week interval between irrigations. So the root zones were drying down to the point of significant stress, and that stress was occurring at different stages of crop development in each of these treatments. Two of these irrigation schedules are of particular interest. The schedule with the most applied water, which was about 21 inches, had a productivity of 386 pounds per acre inch. The second, the one at the top with the second highest applied water, received less water. It received about 18 inches, but showed a productivity of 526 pounds per acre inch. So with 9% less water, that irrigation treatment produced almost 40% higher yields. The difference in productivity was due to irrigation timing, how well each of those schedules was aligned with stages of crop development. As mentioned earlier with those two photos of crop canopy, the most critical time to irrigate that wheat was during grain filling near the end of the season. The higher yielding schedule coincided with that critical stage of growth. The other schedule did not. So back to the question that I raised earlier, should this farm go to full irrigation, or should they reduce the depth of irrigation and use the water saved to increase the acreage under irrigation? If the farm used the same amount of water in either way, total production would be increased by deficit irrigation. Looking at the productivity of water for the two cases we just talked about, full irrigation, 375 pounds per acre inch, 30% deficit irrigation, 533 pounds per acre inch. You multiply that by the number of acre inches the farm has available, and that's the total production, whether it's on a smaller acreage or a larger acreage. Total production at full irrigation would be 375,000 pounds for 1,000 acre inches. But 30% deficit irrigation, whoops, you got ahead of me there, would be 533,000 pounds, about 40% greater. So we've established what happens with productivity. What about the economics in this case? We needed to estimate costs of production and revenues from sale of the crop. For estimates of crop production, I used an enterprise budget developed by the Extension Service for production of winter wheat in the region where that deficit irrigation study was done. The enterprise budget considered all costs of production, including cultural practices such as land preparation, fertilizer applications, weed control, planting costs, and so on. They looked at the variable costs for pumping energy, pest control, labor, and harvest. They included other costs like property taxes and insurance, and they looked at non-cash costs, including interest charges on the land and depreciation of equipment. The productivity figures we are using in this simple little analysis needed to be converted from pounds to bushels because that's how the budgeting was framed. It was framed in terms of cost per bushel of wheat. So we have to divide those yield numbers by 60. There's 60 pounds to a bushel. So now the estimated production cost, the total of all fixed costs per acre, costs that will increase with each additional acre of land in production, independent of wheat production. That figure was $2.43 a bushel. $2.43 an acre per bushel. The variable costs of wheat are primarily harvest costs and independent of acreage, and that figure was $2.72 per bushel. We used a crop price of $6. This enterprise budget looked at a range of crop prices from $4.50 to $7.50 a bushel. One more thing to be sorted out is how much irrigated acreage could be increased under the deficit strategy. based on 17 inches applied for the deficit strategy and 23 inches for full irrigation. The water saved could put 1.35 acres into production for every 1.0 acre under full irrigation. So using those parameters in a simple spreadsheet, the comparison between full irrigation and deficit irrigation looks like this. So comparing the conventional and deficit irrigation, we converted the productivity numbers you saw earlier from pounds per acre inch to bushels per acre inch. That's the first column. The applied water was 23 inches at conventional irrigation, 17 at full. The irrigated land would be for every 1.0 acre, there would be 1.39 acres under deficit. So we calculated from that based on the yield, the acreage, and the price, the $6 price for wheat, we came up with the revenue per acre. We already had the fixed costs and variable costs for per acre and per bushel. That gave us a net cost, or excuse me, a net return per acre of 441 for the conventional, which is slightly less than the 453 for deficit irrigation. But the net farm income would then include the 1.39 factor for additional acreage. So net farm income would be $441 for a unit of land under conventional irrigation and $629 for 1.39 units of land under the deficit scheme. So that makes deficit irrigation look attractive. But this analysis is for a price of wheat of $6 a bushel. Let's go to the next slide. So I looked at two other crop prices just to see what it would do to the analysis, and essentially you get the same result. The deficit irrigation would give you a net farm income at $4.50 a bushel. It would still be 40%, roughly 40% greater net farm income. At $7.50 a bushel, again, it would be about 40% greater net farm income. So, leaving the wheat now and getting on to crops that are more interesting, I think, for your region. Could you give us the next slide, Charles? We'll look at an example that involves an almond producer in Merced County who recently replanted a 92-acre orchard of almonds. For full irrigation of almonds in that region, she would need to apply about 48 inches of water. She has district water that varies from year to year, but for planning purposes, we can assume an average of 33 inches of available water each year. She has to decide how much land to put into production. She does not have enough water to irrigate 92 acres. So let's look at three alternatives. Charles, next one. One alternative would be to deficit irrigation of all of her land, putting 33 inches down on the entire 92 acres. A second option would be full irrigation of as many acres as she could irrigate with that much water. She has 33 inches over 92 acres, so she has 3,036 acre inches to work with. If she were at full irrigation at 48 inches, she could irrigate 63 acres, leaving roughly 30 acres idle. The third option is somewhere between the 33 inches allotment she has and the 48 inches she would need for full irrigation. Let's just arbitrarily choose 40 inches and see what that does. So with 40 inches, she could irrigate 76 acres. Next slide, Charles. To evaluate those three options, we need a production function that relates crop water use to crop yield. This slide shows a production function derived from a 5-year research effort by Goldhammer and Ferreras on a working farm in western Kern County. 10 alternative levels of irrigation were applied, ranging from about 43 inches to 54 inches. There were 8 replications of each of those treatments. The maximum yield point on the curve is about 3,560 pounds per acre with about 53 inches of water use. 5 of those inches would be estimated to be as rain and antecedent moisture. 48 inches would be the irrigation amount. So again, for an economic assessment of those alternatives, we need to estimate cost and revenue. And for that, we'll rely on an economic analysis for almond orchard establishment and production that was published by the UC Extension Service. This analysis was prepared for the northern San Joaquin Valley last year. The alternatives being considered involve differences in acreage, differences in levels of water use, and differences in crop yields. And we want to call those 3 different categories of costs: the costs associated with acreage, the costs associated with yield, and the costs associated with water use. So we needed to assign the various production costs to those 3 categories. Um, the production costs per acre, it's a little bit complicated, but the bottom line is that it worked out to about $3,104 an acre. Um, harvest cost per pound was primarily for um, harvest, and that was about 29 cents a pound. Cost of water worked out to about $200 an acre foot. And the crop price we used was $1.65 a pound, which was the price, the value, the price that the this producer was expecting to get for her yields. With our production function and those economic parameters, we assembled another spreadsheet as shown here. The parameter values that were used in the analysis are shown in that green bar across the top. And the results for the 3 alternatives are highlighted. The ones that we want to talk about are highlighted in blue in these columns. So again, full irrigation, irrigation of all land, and optimal deficit irrigation, something between full irrigation and all land. And again, the acreage was 63 acres for full irrigation, 92 for all acreage. What we found in by trial and error was that the optimal deficit for this farm would be about 68 irrigated acres, 44 inches on 68 acres. The net incomes, I don't want to work through the tedious tables of costs and so on, but the bottom line is at the end on the right. Full irrigation would give a net farm income of about $43,000. Irrigating all of her land, which would be an extreme deficit irrigation, she'd lose money on that at about $18,000. In searching through the alternatives, the optimal deficit we arrived at, 44 inches on 68 acres, would be about $45,800, not quite $46,000. Bottom line is that the optimal deficit irrigation would be better than full irrigation by about 8% and much better than irrigating all the land. So we talked about irrigating more land. The other alternative, if we save water with deficit irrigation, would be to to sell the water into a spot market. To get some idea of the value that the price that might be paid for water markets, I just did a very informal search through the internet and came up with these figures a few days ago. It appears that market prices ranged over the last 3 years, ranged from nearly nothing in a wet year. And see that bottom line, it talks about $5 an acre foot, so essentially nothing in a wet year, to about $550 an acre foot during peak season demand times. So for this little analysis, I'm going to just pick a price arbitrarily at $250 an acre foot and see what that does. We're going to be dealing with alfalfa, and alfalfa has always, I should say, for a long time, has been seen as a crop for which deficit irrigation is pretty tenable. Um, The basic point with alfalfa is that productivity of water falls off quite a bit with late season cuttings. So by eliminating irrigations at the end of the season, you may actually be able to free up quite a bit of water without losing much yield. Last year, a UC research group published this study that focused on a specific strategy for deficit irrigation of alfalfa in the San Joaquin Valley. They tested two irrigation schedules for alfalfa, one in which the alfalfa was fully irrigated through the last cutting, the other in which the crop was irrigated for the first four cuttings, then not irrigated again after the fourth cutting, about mid-August. That study was continued over 4 years. Full irrigation of the alfalfa treatment was averaged 65 inches of water applied. Total water use for the deficit irrigation was averaged 39 inches with no irrigation after the fourth cutting. That deficit irrigation regime yielded about 11% less yield. So now the question is, if we saved that water with the deficit scheme and sold it at $250 an acre foot, what would it do for that farm? Next slide, Charles. This, by the way, shows the results of those two irrigation schedules. Water use by cutting on the left, which indicates that essentially both treatments were irrigated the same up through the first four cuttings. And then the deficits regime was not irrigated again after that. But the average yields per cutting indicate that although yields were virtually the same through the fourth cutting and even through the unirrigated fifth cutting, yields of the deficit were still about half as much as the fully irrigated alfalfa for those last three cuttings. So again, we went to extension estimates of production costs, and what we came up with was the following. And I'll just, without getting into any detail, I'll just say the fixed production cost we found would be $798 an acre. Harvest cost would be about $41 a ton. And the crop price that was used in that sample cost study was $180 a ton, so that's what we used. And again, the deficit irrigation strategy would save 2.13 acre feet of water. I have summarized again in a spreadsheet, and you don't need me to read through the spreadsheet, but we'll focus on the two columns that are highlighted in blue. First of all, the net crop income, that's the income from the production of alfalfa. The deficit scheme would be less by something like 20%, 15%. Net income per acre, $218 versus $258 an acre. But if you then take the 2.13 acres that are freed up and sell them at $250 an acre foot, total farm income would come to $751 for the deficit scheme versus $258 since there's no sale for the fully irrigated scheme. So the deficit scheme would be yielding about triple the net farm income. Okay, what I want to talk about now is the uncertainty associated with deficit irrigation, particularly with regard to crop yields. This graph shows the almond production function that we used earlier in that study for the almond producer in Merced County. It's a production function that was developed by Goldhammer and Ferreras. And the question that I'm raising here is how reliable is a yield estimate using that function? The short answer is that it is not very good at predicting precisely what yields you will get with a given amount of water. And that's because crop yields vary a lot for reasons other than water use, quite a bit. The data points plotted here represent 10 levels of applied water and yield that were used in the study. The lowest data point, oh, and this is over a 5 year study. So the lowest level data point on the left there, for example, was an irrigation regime that targeted 75% of full irrigation. So each data point here represents an average from 5 seasons. Let's break out those data now from those 5 seasons and look at them on a yearly basis. So next slide, Charles. Now what we're looking at is the data points for each of those 5 years separately. So for example, the triangles at the top represent yields and water use averaged over the replications in 2005. The circles, the black circles below that, that's the 2009 data and so on. The red line represents uh, the regression function over all 5 years, and that's what we were using to estimate yields for that almond analysis. But what you see here is that if you look at the variation in yield from 75% of full irrigation to 100% of full irrigation, yields increased about 15% as water use ranged from the lowest to the highest over the season. So 15% variability in yields as a result of water use. But the variation between 1 year and another was plus or minus 30, was within plus or minus 30%. And that, I'm sure you all realize the reason for that is that there are other factors that were biasing the individual years, things like pollination and pest infestations and that sort of thing. So the point is that these other effects overshadowed the effects of water use. So that raises the question, what use is this production function? The answer is that predictions derived from this function are estimates of expected values, and I mean expected in a statistical sense. They predict what average yields might be expected from a given level of irrigation. Another way to think of it is that that function might be used to predict that one level of water use would increase yields by 10% compared to another level of water use. But 10% of what you don't know. That the point is that we're talking about percentage changes in yields rather than absolute numbers. So I'd like to be able to tell everybody who's listening exactly how well this would work out for them. But as I've said before, it depends. It depends on information that is specific to each case. If any of you who want to pursue that question, though, I could give you a little bit of advice on what it is you want to pull together. One thing you have to do is estimate maximum crop water use. What is the 100% water use level? And I don't mean what is the maximum crop water use ever, like in the driest or hottest year you ever had. I mean the average over the long term. What would be the maximum crop water use averaged over 10 years, say? The highest point, the not the extreme, but the total maximum, the highest point of yield for each year over 10 years, say. To get that, you might be able to get some help from CIMMYS. They've done some work on that. Commodity organizations like the Almond Board have worked on the issue of what is the crop water requirement for almonds in a certain area. Extension Service can probably help with that. You also need to determine your cost of production, and of course that depends on what you have in your own records, but you also might find it useful to work side by side, so to speak, with the enterprise budget put out by the UC Extension Service. They're very complete and very interesting, and they're very accessible. You also have to estimate the average attainable yield with full irrigation. And by that, I mean what would be the yield you would expect if you fully irrigated the crop. USDA Economic Research Service would be able to help you with averages of yields for various locations. The commodity services, again, might be able to help. With those inputs and putting together a little spreadsheet like we were looking at earlier, you could analyze in cost returns based on, I would suggest, 90% of full irrigation. It has become a sort of a rule of thumb for people who've played with deficit irrigation quite a bit that 90% of full irrigation, 10% deficit is a good starting point. You'll get some idea of what might be accomplished with deficit irrigation by doing your analysis based on that 90% point. You may find that you want to go farther down, and at that point, you're going to have to, oh, and that would be 90% of full irrigation, and I would recommend 90%, excuse me, 100% of yields because you aren't going to lose much yield with a 10% deficit, providing you're careful about the timing. Um, Thanks. I'm sorry that this was such a ragged presentation, but it was a pleasure putting together for you. I'm happy to take a question.
Dr. English, if that's what your ragged presentation looks like, I hope you never see one of my ragged presentations. That was excellent. Thank you for being put on the spot, but I guess your decades of experience mean that you can do that. So thank you. And as Dr. English said, we'd love to open up for questions. We have uh, again, the pioneer of this practice here today. And so we'd love to hear any questions you have. You can submit them through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we also have Dr. Hillier here again. And I think that Colin English is here as well. Um, so we have a panel of several people who can answer questions. Any questions? I want to make sure that we don't bypass them. If anyone has questions related to deficit irrigation for Dr. English that we can answer at this point. You can also feel free to raise your hand and I will unmute you if you'd like to share your question verbally. Okay, so we have a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, any interesting insights on soil health with deficit irrigation?
Huh. I I'm sorry, but I don't think I can offer anything on that right off the top of my head. I apologize.
I just echo what Marshall said. I haven't seen any studies specifically relating deficit and soil health. Uh, you know, common sense would suggest it's going to have an effect, but as far as I know, it hasn't been explicitly studied yet.
I saw Colin, you raised your hand. I allowed you to unmute. Is there anything that you want to say specifically on that topic, Colin?
Just that soils are a really critical piece of any deficit strategy because the rate of depletion and dry down, the holding capacities are all critical as less water is applied. And if you're working on improving your holding capacity with more organic material, that's going to have an effect. If you are improving your infiltration rate and getting less runoff during winter, that'll have some effect in terms of stored water, your antecedent moisture of the winter water. Other than that, yeah, I don't know that there's a specific any specific research. They've seen that cover cropping seems to, depending on the canopy, seems to either net out, it'll be a zero impact on the total water use of the, or close to zero impact on the total water use of the field. And it does seem to have some cooling effects in the windrows, which can have a positive benefit on the water use, the ET rates, which again is critical when you're dealing with applying low volumes of water. Yeah, but I don't know if there any research beyond that. UC Davis just published a bunch of research on cover cropping and the sort of the range of benefits and challenges that come with that. I could probably give a link to Ashley on that if you're interested.
That'd be great. Thank you. We also have a question from Kenny who asks, do you know the long-term effects of deficit irrigation related to almond trees?
Long-term effects. Well, there's a year-to-year effect. In other words, there's a memory effect in following years, depending on how you irrigate at the end of the season. But long-term, I don't have anything on that with respect to almonds. What I have heard from people at Davis is that that memory effect is pronounced in the first year, but it can also be the second year after an irrigation season as well. Colin was also into that, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know if you can still hear me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there. I think what we're seeing on sites where they've been historically using low levels of applied water, you'll see I think maybe a higher alternate bearing effect on almonds. The research from Davis is, I mean, when you talk to them, they'll tell you that it's inconclusive. There's right now another trial operating with about 2 feet of water up in Madeira. They're 4 years, I think, into it. And so that's one of the questions they're hoping comes out of that work. But, basically with any perennial crop, you're building carbohydrates one year and then using them the next year. And it's the same with vines. So you're going to end up, the amount of water that you apply one year will be stored in some form for the development of the crop the next year. There is probably a bunch of research that still needs to be I know they're still working on those questions, like where is the water best applied during the season? With almonds, it's generally, May, June, and now they're starting to point at July again. For a while, they said July you can deficit. Now they're saying maybe you shouldn't. And then post-harvest irrigation is really critical. So the growth stages again is a pretty critical thing. But in terms of like how much water you can get away with, one of our colleagues is from Lebanon in the Middle East, and they don't irrigate their almonds at all. They get water from snowpack and rainfall, but it's not much. They also get no yield. So not much yield. So if what you're trying to do is stay in business, you're going to have to find that balance between applied water and yield. And we've seen people do 30 inches for 20 years, and they still pull something out. We've seen people do less for 12 years and they're still getting by. It's really a matter of finding that sweet spot, because if you're in business, you have to hit a certain yield or your production costs overwhelm you. So coming back to the whole deficit approach, you have to really understand your productivity of water, and that's what Marshall was getting into there.
So what I heard from you, Colin, is two key things. One, you have seen farmers who have done deficit irrigation on almonds for an extended period of time, and that there are still studies being done to determine at what growth stages irrigation is most critical and how that has long-term effects. Is that correct?
Yeah, that research is still ongoing. They've been looking at it for 30 years, and so they're pretty, it's real a lot of minutia at this point. But in terms of like how hard of a deficit can you apply and maintain, and for how long can you do that? It really comes down to how much, I think, how much money you need to make from those trees, because the amount of water that you apply is proportional to the productivity, you know. So it with and there are really old almond trees out there that never get much water. It's really a matter of what can your business sustain. I mean, as a farming's a business. If you can't get enough yield to really make it make sense, it's you're not really going to be there for very long. And that's again what Marshall was pointing at. In the Columbia Basin, there are a lot of growers who would try and stretch that limited water as far as they could, and they get to that break point where the return on the input costs just didn't match the yields they were getting, and so that, I think, in terms, I think an almond tree could probably take quite a bit. I know Ken Shackle basically tried to kill one, and it didn't really work by drought, deficit, and so I think they can be pretty hardy. It really is what can the economics of your operation withstand? It's
Yeah.
probably going to be the first thing you look at.
Thank you, Colin.
Yeah, that was a lot. Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it. Ashley, you do a wonderful job.
Well, I just want to thank Dr. Marshall English again in our last minute of this webinar. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with growers and irrigators in the Magsa region. I'm excited that this was recorded so that we can come back to it and share it with those who weren't able to attend today. This was so practical. I appreciate too the research that you did to ensure that it was relevant to our growers, and we just can't thank you enough for your time and expertise.
Well, those are generous remarks, Ashley. Thank you.
We appreciate you. All right. Well, we are coming up to our time. As always, if there are any lingering questions, please email info@mcmullenarea.org. We can be sure to get your questions to Dr. English and make sure that there are no questions unanswered.